As the night settles in and the noise of the day slowly fades into the background, there's something strangely comforting about exploring ideas that sit just on the edge of what we understand. Not quite myth, not quite history, but something in between. Tonight, we're stepping into one of those spaces, a topic that has quietly lingered in ancient texts, religious traditions, and even modern speculation: the Watchers. Before we go any deeper, take a moment to get comfortable. And if you enjoy these kinds of slow, thoughtful explorations, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps more than you might think. And I'm always curious, where are you listening from tonight? Somewhere quiet, I hope. Somewhere that lets your mind wander just a little further than usual. Now, when we talk about the Watchers, we're not starting from pure imagination. This isn't something invented recently for entertainment. The idea comes primarily from an ancient text known as the Book of Enoch, a work that didn't make it into the standard biblical canon for most traditions, but was widely read and discussed in the ancient world. In fact, fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggesting that it held significant importance for certain communities. According to the mainstream scholarly understanding, the Watchers are described as a group of angels, beings tasked with observing humanity. The term itself implies their role: watchers, observers, overseers. In this interpretation, they were part of a divine order, meant to guide or monitor human development, perhaps ensuring that the world unfolded according to some larger design. But the story doesn't remain simple for long, because in the narrative of the Book of Enoch, something goes wrong. The Watchers, instead of remaining distant and impartial, become involved. They descend to Earth. They interact with humans. And more importantly, they begin to teach, sharing knowledge that, according to the text, was not meant for humanity at that time. Things like metallurgy, weapon making, cosmetics, astronomy. Knowledge that, depending on how you interpret it, could be seen as either advancement or disruption. Mainstream scholars tend to interpret this story symbolically. They see it as an ancient attempt to explain the origin of human knowledge, especially knowledge that might have seemed dangerous or morally ambiguous. Why do humans possess the ability to create tools of war? Why do we develop technologies that can both build and destroy? The Watchers, in this sense, become a metaphor, a way of framing the idea that knowledge itself can be a double-edged sword. And that interpretation is grounded, reasonable, and consistent with how many ancient myths function. Stories often serve as explanations for complex realities, especially in times when scientific understanding was limited. The Watchers, then, might simply represent humanity's early struggle to understand its own capabilities. But this is where things begin to get a little more interesting. Because when you look closely at the details, there are patterns and questions that don't fully settle into a purely symbolic explanation. The text doesn't just say that knowledge appeared, it describes specific beings with specific actions, making deliberate choices. It describes a kind of rebellion, a crossing of boundaries, and it raises a subtle but persistent question. Why frame this as an external intervention at all? If the goal was simply to explain human knowledge, why not attribute it directly to human discovery? Why introduce these Watchers as intermediaries? One possibility, of course, is narrative structure. Stories are more compelling when they involve characters, conflict, and consequences. But another possibility, one that has been explored cautiously by some researchers, is that these accounts might reflect something more experiential, not necessarily literal in the way the text describes, but perhaps rooted in events or perceptions that ancient people struggled to interpret. Throughout history, there have been recurring themes of beings interacting with humanity, not just in the Book of Enoch, but across multiple cultures. Figures that descend from the sky, entities that bring knowledge, observers who, for reasons unclear, take an interest in human development. In Mesopotamian traditions, in early Greek accounts, even in certain interpretations of early Hindu texts, similar patterns appear. Now, the mainstream view again would suggest convergence, different cultures independently creating similar myths to explain universal human experiences. And that's a strong explanation. Humans everywhere look at the sky, wonder about their origins, and create stories that reflect those questions. But if we slow down and examine the structure of these stories, there's a subtle consistency that's hard to ignore. The idea of watchers, not rulers, not creators, but observers, appears repeatedly. And that distinction matters. A creator implies origin, a ruler implies control, but a watcher suggests something else entirely: observation without direct intervention, or perhaps observation with very limited, very specific moments of interference. And this is where the line between accepted history and speculative interpretation begins to blur just slightly. Because if we entertain the possibility, not as a conclusion, but as a question, that these stories are describing something real in a distorted or symbolic way, then we have to ask, what would watching actually mean in a real-world context? Why observe humanity at all? For what purpose? From a purely scientific standpoint, observation is tied to learning. We observe systems to understand them, to track their development, to see how they change over time. And if you apply that logic here, even hypothetically, it raises a curious idea. What if the concept of watchers reflects an ancient intuition that humanity itself is being observed? Not necessarily by angels as described in religious texts, but by something, whether natural, unknown, or misunderstood, that operates in a similar role. Now, to be clear, there is no direct evidence for this, no measurable data that confirms the existence of such observers, and it's important to stay grounded in that reality. But the persistence of the idea across time and culture invites at least a moment of reflection. Because even within the Book of Enoch itself, the watchers are not portrayed as entirely foreign or incomprehensible. They have motivations. They make decisions. They experience consequences. In a way, they are described almost human-like. And that raises another question. Were these descriptions shaped to make the story relatable? Or do they reflect an attempt to describe something unfamiliar using familiar terms? Ancient people didn't have the language we have today. They didn't have concepts like advanced technology, non-human intelligence, or complex systems theory. So if they encountered something outside their understanding, how would they describe it? Likely in the only framework they had: spiritual, divine, or mythological. And that brings us back to the watchers, not as a fixed idea, but as a lens. A way of looking at the past that acknowledges both the limits of ancient interpretation and the possibility that not everything was fully understood at the time. So as you settle in and let these ideas drift through your mind, consider this. The watchers, whether symbolic or something more, represent a boundary, a point where knowledge, observation, and mystery intersect. A reminder that even in our modern world, with all our data and technology, there are still gaps, places where we don't yet have clear answers. And maybe that's what makes this topic so quietly compelling. Not because it offers definitive conclusions, but because it encourages us to look a little closer, to ask slightly different questions, and to remain open to the possibility that some stories, no matter how old, still have layers we haven't fully uncovered. As we continue, it helps to slow the pace even further. Not just to follow the story, but to examine the structure beneath it. Because the deeper you look into the idea of the watchers, the more it begins to feel less like a single isolated account and more like a fragment of a much larger pattern, one that stretches across geography, language, and time. In the mainstream academic view, the Book of Enoch is often treated as a product of its era, likely written between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE. It reflects a period of intense theological development, where questions about good, evil, divine justice, and human suffering were being explored in increasingly complex ways. The Watchers, in this framework, become part of an evolving narrative meant to address a specific problem. Why does evil exist in the world, and where did it come from? The answer presented is structured, almost methodical. A group of beings, originally aligned with order, choose to step outside their assigned role. They interfere. They share knowledge prematurely, and in doing so, they disrupt the balance. The result is not just moral corruption, but a kind of cascading effect. Violence increases, disorder spreads, and humanity begins to change in ways that are difficult to control. From a symbolic standpoint, this aligns with a very human concern: the fear that knowledge, once introduced, cannot be contained. That certain discoveries, whether technological or intellectual, can fundamentally alter the trajectory of civilization. And when you consider the time period, this interpretation makes sense. Early societies were encountering rapid developments, new tools, new methods of warfare, new forms of organization. The idea that such advancements could be both beneficial and dangerous would have been very real. But again, there's a subtle layer beneath the surface that invites a closer look. Because the Watchers are not described as inventors. They don't create knowledge from nothing. They reveal it. They introduce it. Which suggests that, within the logic of the text, this knowledge already existed. It was simply not accessible to humans until that moment. And that distinction, while small, is important. It raises a question that feels surprisingly modern. Is knowledge discovered, or is it uncovered? Does it emerge naturally from human curiosity, or does it exist independently, waiting to be accessed under the right conditions? In science, this question still lingers in different forms. Mathematical truths, for example, often feel less like inventions and more like discoveries, structures that seem to exist whether we recognize them or not. Physical laws behave the same way. We don't create gravity or electromagnetism. We observe and describe them. They were always there. So when ancient texts describe knowledge being given, it's worth considering whether this could reflect an early attempt to grapple with that same idea. That knowledge might exist beyond immediate human reach, and that accessing it, whether through effort, insight, or something else, can feel almost like receiving it from an external source. And this is where the Watcher's narrative begins to blur slightly into something more abstract. Because if we reinterpret the story through that lens, the Watchers don't necessarily have to be literal beings descending from the sky. They could represent moments of sudden advancement, periods where human understanding seems to leap forward unexpectedly, times when knowledge appears to arrive faster than it can be fully processed. But even that interpretation doesn't fully resolve everything. Because the text goes further. It describes not just knowledge transfer, but interaction, relationships, even consequences that are framed in physical, tangible terms. The Watchers are said to have taken human wives, to have produced offspring, and to have become deeply entangled in the human world. These details are often interpreted symbolically as well, perhaps representing the blending of different cultures, or the merging of ideas that lead to unforeseen outcomes. Yet the specificity of the narrative continues to stand out. And when we widen the scope beyond a single text, the pattern becomes even more noticeable. In ancient Mesopotamia, there are accounts of the Anunnaki, figures who descend from the heavens and play a role in shaping human civilization. In Greek mythology, the Titans are associated with knowledge, power, and conflict with a higher order. In various traditions across the world, there are recurring references to sky beings, teachers, and watchers, entities that exist at the boundary between the human and the divine. The mainstream explanation, again, is convergence. Different cultures, facing similar existential questions, arrive at similar narrative solutions. And statistically, that's a very reasonable conclusion. Humans share common cognitive patterns. We tell stories in similar ways. We project agency onto the unknown. But if we take a step back and look not just at the existence of these stories, but at their structure, a quieter question begins to form. Why does the role of observer appear so consistently? Why not just creators, or rulers, or gods who act directly and openly? Why this recurring idea of beings who watch, who intervene occasionally, but who are not fully integrated into the human experience? From a purely speculative standpoint, carefully grounded but still worth considering, it mirrors something we understand very well today: systems of observation. In modern science, observation is fundamental. We study ecosystems, we monitor behavior, we track changes over time. And importantly, we often do so without direct interference, because interference can alter the outcome. The act of watching in itself becomes a method of understanding. So if ancient people were trying to describe something that felt like it was being observed, something subtle, not overtly controlling but not entirely absent, what language would they use? Perhaps something like watchers. Now, this doesn't mean that ancient texts are secretly describing advanced surveillance systems or external intelligences. There's no direct evidence to support that, and it's important to stay grounded in what can be verified. But the conceptual parallel is interesting. It suggests that the idea of being observed is not new. It's something that has surfaced repeatedly, in different forms, across different eras. And maybe that says more about us than it does about anything external. Because humans are naturally self-aware. We think about how we are perceived. We imagine perspectives beyond our own. And sometimes, that awareness extends outward, into the idea that we might be part of something larger, something that sees us in ways we can't fully see ourselves. The watchers, then, could be understood as a projection of that awareness, a way of externalizing the feeling that our actions are being noticed, that our development is being tracked, that we are not entirely alone in the process of becoming what we are. But even within that interpretation, there's still an unresolved tension. Because the watchers are not passive. They cross a line. They interfere. And that interference has consequences. Which brings us to a subtle but important shift in the narrative. The story is no longer just about observation. It's about what happens when observation becomes involvement. When the boundary between watcher and participant begins to dissolve. And that boundary is where things tend to become unpredictable. As you let that idea settle, notice how it connects to broader patterns, not just in ancient texts, but in modern contexts as well. The moment an observer becomes part of a system, the system changes. The dynamic shifts. Outcomes become less certain. And perhaps that's one of the deeper themes embedded in the story of the Watchers. Not just a caution about knowledge or a myth about origins, but a reflection on the delicate balance between observing and interfering, between understanding and altering, between watching from a distance and stepping too close. A balance that even now we're still trying to navigate. As we move deeper into this quiet exploration, it becomes useful to shift our focus slightly, not away from the watchers themselves, but toward the consequences described in the accounts. Because sometimes, the clearest way to understand a story is not by examining its characters directly, but by studying what happens after they act. Cause and effect often reveal more than intention ever could. In the narrative of the Book of Enoch, the arrival and involvement of the Watchers is followed by a noticeable change in the world. The text describes an increase in chaos, in violence, in imbalance. Humanity, which had previously existed in a more ordered state, at least within the logic of the story, begins to shift. There is a sense that something has accelerated, that a boundary has been crossed, and that things are now unfolding faster than they should. From a mainstream perspective, this is often interpreted as a moral narrative, a reflection of how ancient societies understood corruption, not as something that emerges gradually from within, but as something introduced, something that disrupts an otherwise stable system. It's a way of explaining why the world contains both beauty and disorder, why human progress can lead to both creation and destruction. And in that sense, the Watchers become a narrative device for exploring responsibility. If knowledge is given, who is accountable for how it is used? If boundaries are crossed, who bears the consequences? These are questions that remain deeply relevant, even now. But there is another layer here, one that becomes visible when we look at the specific types of knowledge the Watchers are said to have introduced. Metallurgy, the crafting of tools and weapons, the ability to manipulate the physical world in increasingly precise ways. Astronomy, the study of the heavens, the tracking of time, the prediction of cycles. Even cosmetics and adornment, subtle forms of altering appearance and perception. Individually, these might seem like unrelated skills, but collectively, they represent something more cohesive. They point toward a transition from a simpler mode of existence to a more complex, more controlled interaction with the environment. In other words, they describe the early stages of civilization. And this is where the story begins to intersect, quietly but unmistakably, with what we understand from archaeology and anthropology. There was, in fact, a period in human history where knowledge began to accumulate more rapidly, where tools became more advanced, where societies became more structured, where humans began to exert greater control over their surroundings. This transition didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't the result of a single event. It was gradual, uneven, and shaped by countless factors. But from the perspective of someone living within that shift, or hearing about it generations later, it might not have felt gradual at all. It might have felt sudden, transformative, almost as if something had been introduced that changed everything. And this is where the Watcher's narrative becomes particularly interesting. Not as a literal explanation, but as a lens through which ancient people might have interpreted that transition. Because if you didn't have a framework for technological evolution, if you didn't understand the slow accumulation of knowledge across generations, how would you explain a world that suddenly feels more complex, more dangerous, more advanced than it used to be? You might say that someone, or something, brought that knowledge. And yet, even within that grounded interpretation, there are still details that resist easy categorization. The Watchers are not just teachers. They are described as breaking a rule, as violating a boundary that was understood, at least within the story, to be important. And the consequence of that violation is not just human advancement, but imbalance, a sense that things have moved out of alignment. This introduces a subtle but significant idea that not all progress is neutral, that the timing, the context, and the manner in which knowledge is introduced can matter just as much as the knowledge itself. In modern terms, we might think of this in relation to technologies that develop faster than our ability to manage them, tools that outpace our ethical frameworks, systems that create new possibilities before we fully understand their implications. And while it would be a stretch to draw direct parallels, the underlying concept feels familiar. The tension between capability and control, between discovery and responsibility. But there's another detail in the Watcher's narrative that invites a different kind of reflection, the idea that their actions were not entirely coordinated, that they made a collective decision, an agreement, in some interpretations, to descend and interact with humanity. This suggests not a single directive, but a group dynamic, a shared choice with shared consequences. And that raises an interesting question. Why frame this as a collective decision at all? From a storytelling perspective, it adds complexity. It introduces the idea of agreement, of mutual responsibility. But from a more analytical standpoint, it also reflects something deeply human, the way groups make decisions, sometimes stepping into territory that individuals might hesitate to enter alone. In that sense, the Watchers begin to feel less like distant, abstract beings, and more like a mirror, a reflection of how collective action can amplify both positive and negative outcomes. How groups, driven by shared curiosity or shared desire, can cross boundaries that might otherwise remain intact. And again, this doesn't require a literal interpretation to be meaningful. It works symbolically. It aligns with patterns we can observe in human behavior. But the story doesn't stop at action. It continues into consequence. The Watchers, according to the text, are judged. Their interference is not accepted as neutral or beneficial. It is seen as a disruption that requires correction. And that correction comes in the form of separation, removal from the human world, containment, a restoration of the boundary that was crossed. From a theological perspective, this reinforces the idea of order, that there are structures in place and that violating them has consequences. From a narrative perspective, it brings resolution. It explains why the Watchers are no longer present, at least not in the same way. But from a more reflective standpoint, it introduces a quieter question. If the boundary was restored, what exactly was the boundary? Was it a separation between the human and the divine? Between knowledge and innocence? Between observation and participation? Or was it something more abstract? A limit on how quickly change can occur before a system becomes unstable? Because when you step back and look at the story as a whole, it's not just about beings descending from the sky. It's about thresholds, about crossing lines that are not immediately visible, but that become clear in hindsight. And perhaps that's why the idea of the Watchers continues to resonate, even now. Not because it provides clear answers, but because it captures a feeling, a sense that there are limits we don't always recognize until they've been crossed. That there are points of no return, where the introduction of new elements changes the system in ways that can't be undone. And as you let that thought settle, notice how it connects to the present, to the way we navigate our own advancements, our own discoveries, our own decisions about when to observe and when to act. Because the story of the Watchers, in its quiet, ancient way, is not just about the past. It's about the moment where curiosity becomes action, and action becomes consequence. As we continue to move slowly through this idea, it becomes helpful to shift our attention once again, this time towards something more subtle, something that isn't stated directly in the narrative, but seems to sit quietly beneath it. Because up to this point, we've looked at what the Watchers did, what they introduced, and the consequences that followed. But there's another layer that often goes unnoticed, the question of visibility. Because for beings described as Watchers, observers, overseers, there's a quiet assumption built into the name itself, that they see without necessarily being seen. That they exist in a position slightly outside of normal perception, close enough to observe, but distant enough to remain mostly undetected. And that detail, while easy to overlook, opens up an entirely different line of thought. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers are not constantly present in the human experience. Their appearance is described as a moment, an event, rather than a continuous condition. They descend, they interact, and then, eventually, they are removed or confined, which suggests that their visibility, their direct presence, is limited in both time and scope. From a mainstream perspective, this again fits within the structure of myth. Supernatural beings appear when needed, serve their narrative role, and then exit. It's a common pattern across storytelling traditions. But if we pause for a moment and examine the logic of it more carefully, it raises an interesting possibility. What if the watchers were not meant to be constantly visible? Not in a literal sense, but within the internal logic of the story itself. Their role is observation, not participation. Their presence, when it becomes visible, is framed as a deviation from that role, a breaking of the expected order. And that brings us back to the idea of boundaries, but from a different angle. Because a boundary doesn't just define what can happen, it also defines what can be perceived. There are limits not only on action, but on awareness, on what is allowed to be seen, and when. In modern terms, we're familiar with this concept in subtle ways. There are entire systems operating around us that we don't directly perceive. Processes, signals, structures that exist just outside our immediate senses. We rely on tools to detect them, to translate them into something we can understand. Without those tools, they remain effectively invisible. So when ancient texts describe beings that exist, observe, and only occasionally become visible, it's worth asking, is this purely symbolic? Or does it reflect an intuitive understanding that not everything present is immediately perceivable? Again, there's no need to jump to conclusions here. The grounded explanation remains strong. These are narrative elements shaped by human imagination and cultural context, but the pattern itself is interesting. The idea that something could be present without being obvious, that observation could occur without constant visibility. And this connects to another subtle detail in the Watcher's narrative. The fact that their actions, once revealed, are described with a kind of clarity, as if they were known after the fact, rather than during. The knowledge they introduced is recognized. The consequences are observed. But the process itself, the moment of interaction, feels almost compressed, as if it moved from unseen to fully realized in a short span of time. This creates a slightly unusual dynamic. It suggests that awareness follows impact, that recognition comes after change, rather than alongside it. And if you think about it, that's something we experience often, even now. Changes happen gradually, or quietly, or outside our immediate focus, and only later do we recognize their significance. Only later do we piece together what occurred, how it happened, and what it means. The moment of realization comes after the moment of transformation. So in that sense, the Watcher's narrative may be reflecting a very human experience. The feeling that something has shifted, that something has influenced the course of events, but that the full picture only becomes visible in hindsight. But there's another layer to this, one that becomes clearer when we consider the role of observation itself. Because observation is not passive. Even when it doesn't involve direct interference, it still shapes understanding. It still influences how systems are interpreted, how patterns are recognized, how meaning is constructed. And in some cases, particularly in complex systems, the act of observation can subtly alter the outcome. Not dramatically, not in an obvious way, but enough to change the trajectory over time. So if we return to the idea of the Watchers, not as literal beings but as a concept, it begins to take on a slightly different shape. Not just observers, but participants in a very specific, very limited sense. Participants through awareness, through the act of seeing, recording, understanding. And this is where the boundary becomes even more delicate. Because if observation itself has influence, then the line between watching and interfering becomes less clear. It's no longer a simple distinction. It becomes a spectrum, ranging from complete detachment to subtle influence to direct involvement. And within that spectrum, the Watchers, as described in the text, seem to move from one end to the other, from observation to interaction to consequence, which raises a quiet but persistent question. Was the issue their presence or the degree of their involvement? Because the narrative does not suggest that observation alone was problematic. It suggests that crossing into direct interaction, into teaching, into altering the course of human development, was the point where things began to unravel. And that distinction feels important. It suggests that there is a difference between understanding a system and changing it, between watching something evolve naturally and introducing elements that accelerate or redirect that evolution. In modern contexts, this is something we encounter frequently, especially in fields that involve complex systems, ecology, sociology, even technology. The challenge is often not just to observe, but to decide when and how to intervene, if at all. Too little involvement, and opportunities may be missed. Too much, and unintended consequences can emerge. And perhaps, in its own quiet way, the story of the Watchers is reflecting that same tension. Not as a scientific framework, not as a literal account, but as an early attempt to grapple with a question that remains unresolved even now. When does observation become interference? And how do we recognize that boundary before it's crossed? As you let that question settle, notice how it doesn't demand an immediate answer. It simply opens a space for reflection. A space where the past and the present begin to overlap, not in exact detail, but in underlying patterns. Because whether the Watchers were ever meant to be understood as real beings, symbolic figures, or something in between, the idea they represent continues to echo. The idea that something may be watching, that awareness itself has weight, and that the line between seeing and changing is thinner than it first appears. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the story has endured. Not because it tells us exactly what happened, but because it quietly invites us to consider how much we actually understand about the act of watching itself. As we continue, there's a natural place for the mind to drift, not forward, but slightly backward, toward the origins of the idea itself. Because while the Book of Enoch gives us the most detailed account of the Watchers, it doesn't exist in isolation. It draws from earlier traditions, earlier fragments of thought, and earlier attempts to describe something that was never fully explained. If we trace the idea back, even briefly, we find a small but intriguing reference in the Hebrew Bible itself. In the book of Genesis, there is a passage, short, almost easy to miss, that speaks of the sons of God, who saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives. It's only a few lines, with very little detail, but it introduces a concept that feels strikingly similar to what later becomes the Watchers narrative. Mainstream scholars tend to approach this passage cautiously. Some interpret the sons of God as symbolic figures, perhaps representing powerful rulers or dynasties that intermarried in ways that disrupted social order. Others see it as a fragment of an older myth that was never fully expanded within the canonical text. And that's important, because it suggests that the idea of beings crossing a boundary between realms was already present, even before it was fully developed in later writings. The Book of Enoch doesn't invent the Watchers. It elaborates on something that was already there. It takes a brief, almost cryptic reference and builds an entire narrative around it. It names the beings, describes their actions, and explores the consequences in detail. And this process, this expansion of a small idea into a larger story, is something we see often in the evolution of ancient texts. Over time, concepts are revisited, reinterpreted, and expanded as new questions emerge and as cultural contexts shift. But what's interesting here is not just the expansion itself, it's the direction it takes. Because the story doesn't simply grow more detailed, it becomes more structured. The Watchers are given roles, hierarchies, even individual identities in some versions of the text. They are no longer just a vague group. They become a defined collective, with a leader, with shared decisions, with a clear moment of dissent and a clear set of consequences. And that level of structure suggests something deliberate. From a mainstream perspective, this can be explained as theological development. As ideas about angels, divine order, and cosmic hierarchy became more refined, stories like this were shaped to reflect those evolving beliefs. The Watchers, in this sense, become part of a broader system, a way of organizing the unseen world into something more understandable. But there's another layer to consider, because when stories become more detailed over time, it's not always just about invention. Sometimes it's about clarification, about trying to make sense of something that was originally vague or incomplete. And that raises a subtle question. Was the Watcher's narrative expanding because it was being imagined, or because it was being interpreted? In other words, were these details being created, or were they attempts to better describe something that people felt had already been hinted at? There's no definitive answer, and it's important to stay grounded in that uncertainty. But the pattern itself is worth noticing. The way a brief, ambiguous reference evolves into a detailed account suggests that the idea held a certain weight, enough to be revisited, enough to be explored more deeply. And as we follow that thread, another detail begins to stand out. The Watchers are not described as entirely separate from the divine order. They are part of it. They originate from it. Their role, initially, is aligned with it, which means that their descent is not just a physical movement, it's a shift in position, a change in alignment. And that introduces a different kind of tension, because it's one thing for an external force to interact with humanity. It's another for something that is already part of an established system to step outside its intended role. The narrative, in this sense, is not just about interaction, it's about deviation. From a theological standpoint, this aligns with broader themes of order and disruption. The idea that systems, whether divine or natural, have structure, and that stepping outside that structure leads to imbalance. But from a more analytical perspective, it also reflects something we observe in many complex systems. Entities within a system are often constrained by certain roles or rules. These constraints help maintain stability. But when those constraints are broken, whether intentionally or unintentionally, the system can shift in unpredictable ways. And this brings us back, once again, to the idea of boundaries. Because the Watcher's narrative is not just about crossing a boundary between realms, it's about crossing a boundary within a system, moving from one role to another, from observer to participant, from alignment to deviation. And that kind of shift tends to have ripple effects. In the story, those ripple effects are described in terms of human society: violence, disorder, imbalance. But if we look at it more abstractly, it's a pattern we can recognize in many contexts. When a stable system is disrupted, the effects are rarely isolated. They spread, they compound, they create new conditions that weren't present before. But there's another aspect of the Watchers that becomes more visible as the story develops: the idea of secrecy. Because despite their actions, despite the knowledge they introduce, the Watchers are not portrayed as openly governing or controlling humanity. Their influence is indirect. Their presence is not institutionalized or normalized. It exists in a kind of hidden layer, something that becomes known only through its effects. And that's an interesting detail, because it suggests that whatever role they play, it's not one of sustained visible authority. It's something more transient, more subtle, something that leaves traces rather than structures. From a mainstream perspective, this again fits within the symbolic framework. Hidden influences, unseen forces, the idea that not everything shaping human experience is immediately visible. These are common themes in many traditions. But if we consider it from a slightly different angle, it also reflects the way humans often perceive change. We don't always see the cause directly. We see the outcome. We infer the process. We construct explanations based on what we can observe, even if the underlying mechanism remains unclear. And in that sense, the Watchers become a kind of placeholder, a way of filling in the gap between cause and effect. A way of saying, something happened here, something influenced this shift, even if we don't fully understand what it was. But the story doesn't leave it at that. It moves toward resolution, toward containment, toward the restoration of order. And that resolution, while it provides closure within the narrative, also introduces a lingering question. If the Watchers were removed, if the boundary was restored, does that mean the influence ended completely? Or does it suggest that the system adjusted, that the visible presence was reduced, but the effects remained? Because once knowledge is introduced, it doesn't disappear. Once a system changes, it doesn't return to its original state. It moves forward, shaped by what has already occurred. And that's where the story begins to feel less like a closed narrative and more like an open one. Not something that ended, but something that set conditions in motion. Conditions that, in subtle ways, may still be unfolding. And as you let that thought settle, quietly, without forcing it into any particular conclusion, it becomes clear that the Watchers, whether understood as myth, metaphor, or something more uncertain, are not just part of an ancient story. They are part of a larger pattern of questioning, a way of exploring how change begins, how boundaries are crossed, and how the effects of those moments continue long after the initial event has passed. As we continue drifting through this quiet line of thought, it becomes useful to turn our attention towards something even more subtle. Not just what the Watchers did, or where the idea came from, but how the story itself has been treated over time. Because sometimes, what gets included in history tells one story, and what gets left out tells another. The Book of Enoch, despite its detailed account of the Watchers, is not part of the standard biblical canon in most traditions. It exists on the edges, preserved, studied, referenced, but not officially included alongside texts like the Book of Genesis or others that form the foundation of widely accepted scripture. From a mainstream scholarly perspective, the reasons for this are relatively clear. The canonization process, particularly in early Judaism and later in Christianity, was complex, shaped by theological consistency, authorship considerations, and the desire to establish a stable, unified body of texts. The Book of Enoch, while influential, contains ideas and narratives that don't fully align with the theological frameworks that were eventually formalized. For example, its detailed descriptions of angels, its expansion on the origins of evil, and its portrayal of the Watchers introduce elements that are more elaborate and in some cases more speculative than what appears in canonical texts. Including it might have complicated the emerging structure of doctrine, introducing ambiguities that religious authorities were trying to resolve. And that explanation is grounded, historical, and well supported. But when you step back and look at it more broadly, it also raises a quieter question. What happens to ideas that don't fit neatly into established systems? Because the Watchers' narrative didn't disappear. It continued to circulate. It influenced other writings. It shaped interpretations. Even today, it remains one of the most discussed and revisited ancient texts, particularly when it comes to questions about angels, knowledge, and the boundaries between the human and the divine. So even though it wasn't included in the canon, it wasn't erased. It was set aside. And that distinction matters, because being excluded from a formal system doesn't necessarily mean an idea lacks significance. Sometimes it simply means that the idea introduces complexity, questions that are harder to answer, or perspectives that don't align cleanly with the structure being built. And the Watchers, as a concept, do introduce complexity. They blur lines. They challenge clear distinctions between good and evil, between divine and human, between observer and participant. They introduce the idea that beings within a system can step outside their roles, and that such actions can have lasting consequences. From a theological standpoint, that can be difficult to integrate into a framework that emphasizes order, hierarchy, and clear moral structure. From a narrative standpoint, however, It makes the story more nuanced, more open-ended, and perhaps that's part of why it continues to draw attention. Because it doesn't resolve everything. It leaves space for interpretation. But there's another layer to this as well, one that becomes visible when we consider how knowledge itself is preserved and transmitted. Ancient texts were not static. They were copied, translated, interpreted, and sometimes altered over time. The survival of a text often depended on whether it was valued by the communities preserving it. And in the case of the Book of Enoch, we know that it was valued, at least by certain groups, because it was preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls. That suggests that, at least in some contexts, the Watcher's narrative was considered important enough to keep, to study, to pass down, which raises an interesting point. The same text can hold different levels of importance depending on who is reading it and when. What is considered central in one tradition may be considered peripheral in another. And over time, those distinctions can shape how widely an idea is known, how deeply it is explored, and how seriously it is taken. So when we encounter the Watchers today, we're not just encountering the original narrative, we're encountering the result of centuries of selection, preservation, and interpretation. And that means we're seeing it through layers. Layers of context, layers of translation, layers of cultural perspective, which makes the act of understanding it a little more complex, but also a little more interesting. Because it invites us to consider not just the content of the story, but the process by which the story reached us. Why was it preserved? Why was it excluded from certain frameworks? Why did it continue to circulate despite that exclusion? And what does that say about the nature of the idea itself? From a grounded perspective, the answer may simply be that the story is compelling, that it addresses questions people have always asked, about knowledge, about boundaries, about the origins of complexity in the world. But from a slightly more reflective standpoint, it also suggests that some ideas persist, not because they are fully understood, but because they resist being fully explained. They remain relevant precisely because they don't settle into a single interpretation. And the Watchers, in many ways, fit that pattern. They can be understood symbolically as representations of knowledge, of boundary crossing, of the risks associated with rapid change. They can be understood historically as part of a broader tradition of myth-making and theological development, and they can be approached more speculatively as reflections of experiences or intuitions that ancient people struggled to articulate in precise terms. None of these perspectives fully cancels out the others. They coexist, each offering a different way of looking at the same narrative. And that coexistence is, in itself, a kind of balance, a reminder that not all questions need to be resolved in a single direction. That sometimes, the value of a story lies in its ability to hold multiple possibilities at once. As you let that idea settle, notice how it changes the way the Watchers feel, not as a fixed concept, but as something more fluid, something that shifts depending on how you approach it. Because at this point, the question is no longer just, what are the Watchers? It becomes something quieter, and perhaps more interesting. Why has this idea endured? Why does it continue to appear in different forms, across different times? And what is it about the role of observing, of watching, that continues to resonate so deeply with the way we understand ourselves and the world around us? Those questions don't demand immediate answers. They simply open the door a little further, inviting you to look again, to notice details that might have been missed before, to consider possibilities that don't fit neatly into a single explanation. And in that space, somewhere between what is known and what is still uncertain, the story of the Watchers continues, not as something that has been fully explained, but as something that is still being explored. As we move further into this slow unfolding, there's a subtle shift that begins to take place. not in the story itself, but in how we relate to it. Up to now, we've looked at the Watchers as something distant, something ancient, something tied to texts like the Book of Enoch and fragments preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls. But at a certain point, the question naturally turns inward. Not, what were the Watchers? But why does the idea feel familiar? Because there's something quietly recognizable about the concept of being observed. Not in a dramatic or unsettling way, but in a subtle, almost background sense. The feeling that actions are seen, that patterns are noticed, that behavior exists within a wider context, even if that context isn't always fully visible. And this is where the narrative begins to overlap with something deeply human: awareness. Humans are not just participants in the world, we are observers of it. We watch, we analyze, we interpret. And in doing so, we often imagine perspectives beyond our own. We think about how things might look from the outside. We construct viewpoints that extend beyond immediate experience. In a way, we become watchers ourselves. Now, from a grounded perspective, this is simply a feature of consciousness. The ability to reflect, to step back mentally, to observe one's own actions and the actions of others. It's part of what allows for learning, for adaptation, for the development of complex societies. But when you place that capacity alongside the ancient idea of watchers, beings defined primarily by their role as observers, it creates an interesting parallel. Because the distinction between observer and participant is not always clear-cut. Even in our own experience, we move between those roles constantly. Sometimes we are fully engaged, acting, influencing, shaping outcomes. Other times, we step back, watching events unfold, analyzing them from a distance. And often, we do both at the same time, participating while also observing our participation. So when ancient texts describe beings whose primary function is to watch, it's worth considering whether this reflects not just an external concept, but an internal one as well. A projection, perhaps, of our own awareness onto the world around us. But there's another layer to this, one that becomes more visible when we think about how humans perceive patterns. We are naturally inclined to look for structure, for meaning, for connections between events. When something happens, especially something significant, we don't just accept it at face value. We ask why. We look for causes. We try to understand the underlying mechanisms. And sometimes, when those mechanisms are not immediately clear, we fill in the gaps. Not randomly, but in ways that align with our existing frameworks, our beliefs, our experiences, our cultural narratives. So if an ancient society observed rapid changes, advancements in knowledge, shifts in behavior, increases in complexity, they might naturally look for an explanation that accounts for those changes in a structured way. The Watchers, in that sense, provide a framework, a way of organizing the idea that something has influenced the course of events. That change has a source, even if that source is not directly visible. And again, the mainstream explanation remains strong here. This is how myth-making works. It translates complex, often abstract processes into narratives that can be understood and shared. But what's interesting is how persistent this particular framework has been. Because even outside of ancient texts, the idea of observation, of being watched, of being studied, of existing within a larger field of awareness, continues to appear in different forms. Sometimes it shows up in philosophy, in discussions about perception and reality. Sometimes in science, in the way observation is understood to influence certain systems. And sometimes, more subtly, in the way people describe their own experiences, the sense that there is more to the world than what is immediately visible. Now, it's important to stay grounded here. These modern interpretations are not evidence of anything beyond human cognition and perception. They reflect how we think, how we process information, how we construct meaning. But the overlap is still worth noticing. because it suggests that the idea of watchers is not just a historical artifact, it's a recurring pattern of thought, a way of grappling with the relationship between observer and observed. And this brings us back to a question that sits quietly at the center of all of this. What does it mean to watch? Not just in the literal sense, but in the broader sense of awareness, attention, perception. Because watching is not passive. It involves focus. It involves interpretation. It involves a kind of engagement, even when there is no direct action. And in some cases, the act of watching can change the way something unfolds, if only by changing how it is understood. So when the watchers are described as beings who observe, who understand, who choose at some point to intervene, it begins to feel less like a distant myth and more like an exploration of a fundamental dynamic. The dynamic between seeing and doing, between knowing and acting, between understanding a system and becoming part of it. And that dynamic is not limited to ancient stories. It's something we navigate constantly, often without realizing it. Every time we learn something new, we move slightly along that spectrum, from observation toward potential action. Every time we choose whether or not to act on what we know, we are, in a sense, negotiating that same boundary the watchers are said to have crossed. Which brings us to a quieter, more reflective point. Perhaps the enduring nature of the watcher's narrative is not just about the beings themselves, but about the role they represent. The role of the observer who must decide whether to remain at a distance or to step closer. And if that's the case, then the story becomes less about something that happened long ago and more about a pattern that continues to unfold, subtly, repeatedly, in different forms. Not as a literal descent from the sky, but as a recurring moment of choice. A moment where awareness meets action. A moment where the line between watching and participating becomes visible, and sometimes is crossed. As you let that idea settle, there's no need to resolve it, no need to define it too clearly. It's enough to simply notice it, to see how the ancient narrative and the modern experience begin to echo each other, not in exact detail, but in underlying structure. Because sometimes, the most enduring stories are not the ones that explain everything, but the ones that quietly reflect something we're still trying to understand. As we continue, the perspective begins to widen again, not just across texts, but across time itself. Because one of the more intriguing aspects of the Watchers is not simply where they appear, but when. The idea does not belong to a single moment. It seems to echo, reappear, and subtly reshape itself depending on the era in which it is being considered. If we return briefly to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers are framed within a very specific worldview, one where the structure of reality is layered, where divine order exists above human experience, and where boundaries between those layers are meaningful and consequential. But as time moves forward, and as human understanding evolves, the language changes, while the underlying pattern remains. In later theological traditions, the Watchers are often absorbed into broader discussions about angels, fallen beings, and the nature of disobedience. The emphasis shifts slightly, from observation and knowledge sharing to themes of rebellion and moral consequence. The narrative becomes more structured within a framework of right and wrong, of alignment and deviation. And from a mainstream standpoint, this makes sense. As religious systems develop, they tend to refine and organize earlier ideas, integrating them into a more cohesive structure. Ambiguous concepts are clarified. Open-ended narratives are given defined meanings. But even as that happens, something of the original ambiguity lingers. The Watchers are never fully reduced to a single interpretation. They remain, in some sense, on the edge of the system, part of it, but not entirely contained by it. And that's where things begin to take an interesting turn. Because as we move into more modern periods, into the last few centuries, and especially into the present, the language shifts again. The framework changes. The vocabulary becomes more scientific, more technical, more grounded in observation and measurement. And yet, the pattern persists. The idea of observation from outside a system does not disappear. It simply takes on new forms. In science, we talk about observers in terms of measurement, of data collection, of understanding systems from a position that is ideally neutral. In technology, we create tools that monitor, track, and analyze behavior. Systems that, in a sense, watch without direct interference. And in more speculative discussions, carefully separated from established science but still present in cultural thought, there are recurring questions about whether humanity itself might be observed from a broader perspective. Not necessarily in the way ancient texts describe, but in ways that reflect the same underlying curiosity. Now, it's important to stay grounded here. There is no empirical evidence that supports the idea of external observers monitoring humanity in a literal sense. The scientific method relies on measurable, repeatable data, and in that framework, such claims remain unverified. But the persistence of the question itself is worth noticing, because it suggests that the concept of being observed is not tied to a specific belief system or time period. It's something that emerges naturally from the way we think about our place in the world. When we look outward, into space, into the unknown, we don't just ask what is out there. We also, quietly, ask how we might appear from the outside, what our patterns look like, how our development might be perceived if viewed from a different vantage point. And that line of thinking, while modern in its language, mirrors something very old. The Watchers, in this sense, can be seen as an early expression of that same idea, not framed in terms of technology or extraterrestrial observation, but in terms that made sense within the worldview of the time. Beings who watch, who understand, who exist at a level slightly beyond immediate human perception. And as we follow that thread forward, another detail begins to emerge. The idea that observation is linked to scale. Because to observe something effectively, you often need a broader perspective. A position that allows you to see patterns that are not visible from within the system itself. From within a system, you experience events locally. You see individual actions, immediate consequences. But from outside, or from a higher vantage point, you begin to see trends, structures, long-term developments. And this is something we rely on heavily in modern science. We zoom out. We collect data over time. We look for patterns that only become visible at scale. So when ancient texts describe beings who watch humanity as a whole, rather than interacting with individuals in isolated ways, it suggests a kind of perspective that is broader than the human experience. Again, this can be understood symbolically. The Watchers represent a higher level of awareness, a perspective that sees beyond immediate events. But it also introduces a subtle question. What would it actually mean to observe humanity at that scale? Not in a literal sense, but conceptually. It would mean tracking patterns over time, noticing shifts in behavior, in knowledge, in structure, seeing the rise and fall of systems, the emergence of new ideas, the consequences of collective actions. In other words, it would mean understanding humanity as a process, rather than as a collection of isolated moments. And that's a perspective we are only beginning to develop ourselves. Through data, through historical analysis, through the study of complex systems, we are starting to see patterns that extend beyond individual lifetimes. We are beginning to understand how small changes can accumulate into large-scale transformations. So in a quiet way, we are moving closer to the kind of perspective that the Watchers are said to have had. Not because we are becoming like them in any literal sense, but because we are expanding our ability to observe at scale. And that creates an interesting loop. The observers, in the story, are external. They watch humanity from the outside. But as our own capacity for observation grows, we begin to take on a similar role, watching ourselves, analyzing our own patterns, trying to understand the system we are part of. And in doing so, we encounter the same questions. When do we intervene? When do we allow processes to unfold naturally? How do we balance understanding with action? These are not easy questions. They don't have simple answers. And perhaps that's why the Watcher's narrative continues to feel relevant. It touches on a dynamic that is not tied to a specific time or place. The dynamic between perspective and participation, between seeing the bigger picture and deciding what to do with that understanding. As you let that idea settle, notice how the distance between the ancient and the modern begins to narrow. Not because the details are the same, but because the underlying questions are. Questions about observation, about scale, about the role of awareness in shaping the course of events. And somewhere within those questions, the figure of the Watcher remains, not as a fixed image, but as a concept that continues to evolve, to adapt, to reflect the way we think about our place in an ever-expanding context. As we continue to ease further into this exploration, there's a natural shift that begins to happen, not outward into history, but inward into interpretation. Because at this point, the Watchers are no longer just figures in an ancient narrative. They've become something more abstract, something that sits at the intersection of story, perception, and meaning. And to understand that more clearly, it helps to slow down and examine one of the quieter assumptions that often goes unnoticed. The assumption that the Watchers were entirely separate from humanity. In the Book of Enoch, they are described as beings from outside the human world, originating from a higher order, descending into the human domain, and then eventually being removed from it. That structure creates a clear distinction. There is them, and there is us. From a mainstream theological perspective, this distinction is essential. It preserves the hierarchy between the divine and the human, between creator and creation, between observer and participant. It reinforces the idea that different levels of existence operate according to different rules. But when we step back and look at the story more abstractly, that boundary begins to feel less rigid, because the Watchers, despite being described as external, behave in ways that are strikingly familiar. They make decisions, they experience curiosity, they are drawn toward interaction, they form agreements, they cross boundaries, and they face consequences. These are not distant, incomprehensible traits. They are deeply human patterns. And that raises a subtle but important question. Were the Watchers meant to be understood as entirely separate? Or were they described in human terms because they reflect something closer to human experience than it first appears? From a grounded perspective, the answer is likely straightforward. Ancient narratives often anthropomorphize non-human entities, giving them human-like qualities in order to make the story relatable and understandable. It's a common storytelling technique, and it doesn't necessarily imply anything beyond that. But even within that explanation, there's still something worth noticing. Because the Watchers are not just given human traits, they are given human dilemmas. They are placed in a position where they must choose between roles, where they must decide whether to remain within their assigned function or to step outside of it, where their actions carry consequences not just for themselves but for others. And that kind of dilemma feels less like a distant myth and more like a reflection of the way humans navigate their own boundaries. Because in many ways, we are constantly in a similar position. We operate within systems, social systems, cultural systems, technological systems that define certain roles and expectations. These systems provide structure. They create stability, but they also create limits. And at times, we encounter moments where those limits become visible. Moments where we have the option to step outside them, to act differently, to explore something new, to introduce ideas or actions that are not fully aligned with the established order. And in those moments, the same tension appears: curiosity, balanced against consequence; exploration, balanced against responsibility; the desire to understand, balanced against the potential impact of that understanding. So when we look at the Watchers through this lens, they begin to feel less like external beings and more like a narrative embodiment of that tension. A way of exploring what happens when the drive to know, to explore, to engage, moves beyond the boundaries that were originally set. But there's another layer to this as well, one that becomes more visible when we consider how the story frames the outcome. Because the Watchers are not portrayed as purely malicious. Their actions are not described as driven by destruction or chaos for its own sake. Instead, they are driven by interest, by attraction, by a kind of engagement with the human world. And yet, the result of that engagement is imbalance, which suggests something important. That intention and outcome are not always aligned. That actions taken with curiosity, or even with positive intent, can still lead to consequences that are difficult to predict or control. And this is a pattern we see often, both in history and in modern contexts. Advancements that bring benefits also introduce risks. Discoveries that expand understanding also create new challenges. Interventions that aim to improve a system can sometimes destabilize it. So the Watcher's narrative, in this sense, becomes less about judgment and more about complexity. It reflects the idea that crossing boundaries is not inherently good or bad, but that it carries weight, that it changes the system in ways that may not be immediately visible. And that brings us back, once again, to the idea of perspective. Because from within a system, it's difficult to see the full impact of an action. We experience it locally, in the moment, without full awareness of how it will unfold over time. But from a broader perspective, from the kind of vantage point the Watchers are said to have had, the patterns become clearer, the consequences become more visible, and that creates an interesting dynamic. The Watchers, as observers, are positioned to understand the system, but as participants, they become subject to the same limitations as the humans they interact with. Their perspective shifts. Their clarity becomes entangled with involvement. And that shift is where things begin to unravel, because once you are fully inside a system, you no longer see it in the same way. You are influenced by it. You are part of its dynamics. Your actions are shaped by the same forces that shape everything else within it. And that loss of perspective can make it difficult to anticipate the consequences of what you do. So in a quiet way, the story of the Watchers may also be reflecting something about the limits of understanding. The idea that seeing a system from the outside is fundamentally different from experiencing it from within, and that crossing that boundary, moving from observer to participant, changes not just your role, but your perception. As you let that idea settle, it becomes clear that the Watchers are not just a story about ancient beings or distant events. They are a way of exploring a transition, a movement from distance to involvement, from clarity to complexity, from observation to immersion. And within that movement, there is no simple resolution, only a deeper awareness of how delicate that transition can be. Because once the boundary is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed in the same way. The system changes, the perspective changes, and the consequences continue to unfold, often long after the initial moment has passed. And perhaps that's why the story lingers, not because it tells us exactly what happened, but because it captures a moment we recognize, a moment where curiosity leads us forward, and only later do we begin to understand where that path leads. As we continue, there's a subtle transition that begins to take shape, not in the events themselves, but in how time is experienced within the story. Because one of the quieter, often overlooked aspects of the watcher's narrative is not just what happened, but how those events are framed across time. In the Book of Enoch, the actions of the watchers unfold in what feels like a condensed sequence. They descend, they interact, they introduce knowledge, and consequences follow. The structure is direct, almost immediate. Cause and effect appear closely linked, as though the impact of their actions is quickly visible and clearly understood. From a narrative standpoint, this makes sense. Stories often compress time to maintain clarity. Events that may have unfolded gradually in reality are presented in a more immediate sequence, allowing the listener or reader to grasp the connection between action and consequence without losing the thread. But when we step back and consider this more carefully, an interesting question begins to form. What if the events described weren't actually experienced as immediate? What if the sense of sudden change was, in part, a result of how the story was told, rather than how it originally unfolded? Because when we look at real-world systems, especially complex ones like human societies, change is rarely instantaneous. It builds over time. It accumulates. It often goes unnoticed in its early stages, only becoming visible once it reaches a certain threshold. And when that threshold is crossed, it can feel sudden. A shift that seemed to happen all at once, even though it was developing gradually beneath the surface. So when the watchers are described as introducing knowledge that leads to rapid transformation, it's worth considering whether this might reflect a similar pattern. Not a single moment of change, but a period of acceleration, a point where multiple developments converge and begin to reshape the system in noticeable ways. And if that's the case, then the watchers themselves might represent not just the source of change, but the moment when change becomes visible. The point at which gradual processes reach a level that can no longer be ignored. From a mainstream perspective, this aligns well with how ancient narratives often function. They take complex, extended processes and frame them in terms of identifiable events or figures. It's a way of making sense of transitions that would otherwise be difficult to describe. But there's another layer to this as well, one that becomes more apparent when we think about how humans perceive time. Because our experience of time is not always consistent. Moments of stability can feel long and uneventful, while periods of change can feel compressed, intense, almost accelerated. When something significant happens, it tends to stand out, to define a before and after, even if the underlying causes were present long before the moment itself. So when ancient texts describe a turning point, a moment where the world shifts from one state to another, it may not be describing a literal instant. It may be capturing the experience of that shift, the feeling that something has changed in a way that is both undeniable and difficult to fully explain. And this brings us back to the watchers, not just as actors in a story, but as markers of transition, indicators that something has moved from one phase into another. And when we look at the specific changes associated with them, advancements in knowledge, shifts in behavior, increases in complexity, it begins to resemble something we might describe, in modern terms, as a threshold event. A point where the system crosses into a new state. Now, it's important to stay grounded here. This doesn't mean that the watchers are literal representations of such events. The mainstream explanation remains rooted in symbolic storytelling, in mythological frameworks that seek to explain complex realities through narrative. But the parallel is still worth exploring, because it suggests that the story may be capturing not just what happened, but how it felt to those experiencing it, or to those trying to understand it after the fact. The sense that the world had changed, that something had accelerated, that knowledge had expanded in ways that were both empowering and destabilizing. And within that experience, the figure of the Watcher becomes a kind of anchor, a way of giving form to a transition that might otherwise feel abstract. But there's another aspect of time within the narrative that deserves attention. The idea that the consequences of the Watcher's actions extend beyond their presence. They are removed. The boundary is restored. And yet, the changes they introduced remain. This creates a kind of temporal layering, an initial event, followed by lasting effects. And that's something we see often in real-world systems as well. Certain moments, certain decisions, certain discoveries set conditions in motion that continue long after the original context has passed. The cause may fade into history, but the effects become part of the ongoing structure of the system. So in that sense, the Watcher's narrative is not just about a moment in time, it's about a shift that continues to influence what comes after. A transition that becomes part of the system's new baseline. And that introduces a quieter, more reflective question. If the Watchers represent a moment of change, a crossing of a threshold, then what does that say about the nature of thresholds themselves? Because thresholds are not always obvious in advance. They are often recognized only after they have been crossed. Only after the system has changed enough for the difference to become clear. And that means that, in many cases, we don't fully understand the significance of a moment until we are already on the other side of it. So when the story describes the Watchers descending, interacting, and then being removed, it may also be reflecting something about how humans understand change. We identify a moment. We assign it meaning. We look back and say, this is where things shifted, even if the reality is more complex, more gradual, more difficult to define precisely. And as you let that idea settle, it becomes clear that the Watchers are not just figures in a distant past. They are part of a pattern of interpretation, a way of organizing the experience of change, a way of marking the transition from one state to another, from one level of understanding to the next. And perhaps that's why the story continues to resonate. Because even now, we encounter moments that feel like thresholds, moments where something shifts, where understanding expands, where the system becomes more complex than it was before. And in those moments, we often look for a way to describe what happened, a way to anchor the transition, a way to say, this is where things changed. The Watchers, in their quiet, ancient way, may be one of the earliest expressions of that impulse. Not a final answer, but a marker, a point of reference in the ongoing process of trying to understand how change begins, and how it continues long after the moment itself has passed. As we continue to move deeper into this quiet space of reflection, there's another layer that begins to emerge, one that isn't immediately obvious, but becomes clearer the longer you sit with the idea. It's not just about what the Watchers did, or when they appeared, but about how their presence is described in relation to knowledge itself. Because in the Book of Enoch, knowledge is not treated as neutral. It is not simply a tool, or a resource, or an inevitable outcome of curiosity. It is framed as something that carries weight, something that can shift the balance of a system depending on how and when it is introduced. And that framing is worth paying attention to. In modern thinking, especially within science, knowledge is often seen as inherently valuable. The more we understand, the better equipped we are to navigate the world. Discovery is generally associated with progress, with advancement, with improvement. But even within that framework, there is an awareness, sometimes quiet, sometimes more explicit, that not all knowledge arrives without consequence. Certain discoveries bring ethical questions. Certain technologies introduce risks alongside their benefits. Certain insights change not just what we can do, but how we think about what we should do. So when ancient texts describe knowledge as something that can disrupt balance, it's not entirely foreign to modern experience. It's simply framed in a different language. And in the case of the Watchers, the emphasis is not just on the knowledge itself, but on the timing and the context in which it is given. The implication is subtle, but important. That knowledge introduced too early, or without the structures needed to manage it, can lead to instability. From a mainstream perspective, this aligns with a moral interpretation. The story becomes a cautionary tale about overreach, about stepping beyond appropriate limits, about the dangers of acquiring power without the wisdom to use it responsibly. But there's another way to look at it as well, one that is less about morality and more about systems. Because in any complex system, the introduction of new variables can change the way the system behaves. Sometimes those changes are beneficial, sometimes they are neutral, and sometimes they create feedback loops that lead to unexpected outcomes. So if we think of knowledge as a kind of variable, something that alters the state of the system, then the Watcher's narrative begins to resemble an early attempt to describe what happens when that variable is introduced rapidly, or in ways that the system is not fully prepared to absorb. And that brings us back to the idea of thresholds, because systems often have limits, points at which they can no longer maintain stability under certain conditions. When those limits are crossed, the system shifts into a new state, and that shift can be difficult to reverse. In the story, the actions of the Watchers seem to push the human world towards such a threshold. The introduction of knowledge accelerates change, increases complexity, and ultimately leads to a loss of balance. But what's interesting is that the knowledge itself is not portrayed as inherently negative. Metallurgy, astronomy, craftsmanship. These are not destructive in isolation. They are tools, methods, ways of interacting with the world. The issue, then, is not the existence of knowledge, but the way it interacts with the system into which it is introduced. And that's a distinction that feels increasingly relevant the more you think about it. Because even now, we encounter situations where the pace of discovery outstrips our ability to adapt, where new capabilities emerge faster than the frameworks needed to manage them, where the introduction of knowledge creates both opportunity and uncertainty at the same time. And in those moments, the question is not just, what have we learned, but what does this change? So when the Watchers are described as bringing knowledge that alters the course of human development, it may not be necessary to interpret that literally in order to see its relevance. It can be understood as a reflection of a deeper pattern, the relationship between knowledge and stability. But there's another layer to this as well, one that becomes visible when we consider how the story assigns responsibility. Because the Watchers are held accountable for their actions. Their decision to share knowledge is not treated as a neutral event. It is framed as a choice, one that carries consequences. And that introduces an interesting dynamic. It suggests that the act of sharing knowledge is not just about the information itself, but about the decision to make it accessible. From a modern perspective, this raises questions about responsibility in the dissemination of information. Who decides what should be shared, and when? How do we balance openness with caution? How do we ensure that knowledge is used in ways that align with broader stability? These are not simple questions, and they don't have universal answers, but they echo, in a quieter way, the same tension that appears in the Watcher's narrative. The tension between the desire to know and the responsibility that comes with knowing. And perhaps that's why the story continues to feel relevant. Because it doesn't present knowledge as purely positive or purely negative. It presents it as something that interacts with context, with timing, with the structure of the system itself. Something that can illuminate, but also complicate. Something that can empower, but also destabilize. And as you let that idea settle, it becomes clear that the Watchers are not just figures associated with observation. They are also associated with transmission. They are the point at which knowledge moves from one domain to another, from the unknown to the known, from the inaccessible to the accessible. And in that movement, something changes. Not just in what is known, but in how the system behaves. And that change, once it begins, cannot simply be undone. It becomes part of the ongoing process, part of the unfolding, part of the story that continues long after the initial moment has passed. So as you rest with that thought, there's no need to resolve it, no need to define it too clearly. It's enough to recognize the pattern, to see how the ancient narrative and the modern experience begin to align, not in detail, but in structure. Because sometimes, the most enduring ideas are the ones that don't just explain the past, but quietly reflect something that is still happening. As we continue, there's a gentle shift that begins to take place, away from the actions of the watchers and towards something more difficult to define. Not what they did, not what they brought, but how their presence is remembered. And perhaps more importantly, how it fades. Because one of the more curious aspects of the Watcher's narrative, especially as described in the Book of Enoch, is that their story feels both significant and strangely incomplete at the same time. They appear, they act, they influence the course of events. And then, in a relatively short span of narrative time, they are removed, contained, no longer active in the same way. From a traditional perspective, this provides closure. The disruption is addressed, order is restored, and the system returns, at least in principle, to a more stable state. It's a familiar structure in many ancient stories, a disturbance, followed by correction, followed by resolution. But if we sit with it a little longer, there's something about that resolution that feels partial. Because while the watchers themselves are removed, the effects of their actions are not reversed. The knowledge they introduced remains. The changes they set in motion continue. The system, once altered, does not return to its original form. And that creates a kind of quiet asymmetry. The cause is removed, but the consequences persist. And that raises a subtle question. Was the removal of the watchers meant to end the process, or simply to prevent further interference? Because those are two very different outcomes. Ending a process would suggest a return to a previous state, a restoration of what existed before. But preventing further interference suggests something else entirely. It implies that the system has already changed, and that the focus is now on stabilizing that new state rather than reversing it. From a grounded perspective, this aligns with how complex systems behave. Once a significant change has occurred, it's rarely possible to go back completely. The system adapts, it reorganizes, it finds a new balance, even if that balance is different from what came before. So when the watchers are removed, it may not represent a full reset. It may represent a transition into a new phase, one where the initial disruption has been contained, but the underlying changes continue to unfold. And this brings us to something even more subtle. The idea that the most lasting influence is not always the most visible one. Because the watchers, in their active role, are described in relatively vivid terms. Their descent, their actions, their interactions. These are the moments that stand out. But once they are gone, the story becomes quieter. The influence becomes less direct, less defined. And yet, it continues, in the knowledge that remains, in the changes that persist, in the new conditions that shape what comes next. This creates a kind of lingering presence, not of the watchers themselves, but of what they set into motion. And that's an interesting pattern, because it reflects something we see often in history. Certain events, certain decisions, certain moments of change have effects that extend far beyond their immediate context. The original cause may fade into the background, but the consequences become part of the ongoing structure of the system. Over time, those consequences can even become normalized, accepted as part of how things are, rather than recognized as the result of a specific moment of change. So when we look back, we see the outcome, but not always the origin. And this is where the Watcher's narrative begins to feel less like a closed story and more like an open one. because even though the watchers themselves are no longer present within the narrative, the conditions they helped create remain part of the world that follows. And that creates a kind of continuity, a sense that the story didn't really end, it simply changed form. But there's another layer to this as well, one that becomes more visible when we think about memory, because the way a story is remembered can shape how it is understood. Over time, details are emphasized or de-emphasized. Certain aspects are highlighted, while others fade into the background. Interpretations shift, context changes. And in the case of the watchers, the memory of their story has taken on different forms depending on who is telling it and why. In some interpretations, they are seen primarily as a warning, a cautionary tale about crossing boundaries. In others, they are viewed more neutrally, as part of a larger narrative about the origins of knowledge and complexity. And in more speculative discussions, they are sometimes revisited as something that might represent more than just symbolism. None of these interpretations fully replaces the others. They coexist, each reflecting a different way of engaging with the same underlying narrative. And that coexistence is part of what keeps the story alive, because a story that can only be understood in one way tends to settle, to become fixed. But a story that allows for multiple interpretations continues to evolve. It invites ongoing exploration, and the watchers, in this sense, remain just out of reach of a single, definitive explanation. They are remembered, but not fully resolved. They are described, but not completely understood. And that creates a kind of open space within the narrative, a space where questions can continue to exist without being forced into immediate answers. So as you let that idea settle, notice how it shifts the way the watchers feel. Not as a completed chapter, but as an ongoing influence. Not as something that happened and ended, but as something that began and continues in quieter, less visible ways. Because sometimes, the most enduring aspects of a story are not the moments of action, but the patterns that remain after those moments have passed, the changes that become part of the background, the influences that shape what comes next, even when their origin is no longer at the center of attention. And perhaps that's where the watchers truly linger. Not in direct presence, not in visible form, but in the structure of the narrative itself, in the way it continues to prompt reflection, to raise questions, to invite a deeper look at how change begins, and how it continues long after the initial moment has faded. As we continue, there's a quiet shift that begins to take shape, not in the story itself, but in the way we interpret distance. Because up to this point, the watchers have often been framed as something removed, something above, beyond, or outside the human experience. But the more closely we examine the structure of the narrative, the more that sense of distance begins to soften, not disappear, but become less certain. In the Book of Enoch, the watchers are described as descending, moving from one level of existence to another. That movement implies separation at the start, a clear distinction between where they are and where humanity exists. But once they arrive, that separation becomes less stable. They interact, they engage, they become part of the environment they were originally observing. And in that moment, something subtle changes. Because distance is not just about physical space, it's about perspective, about how separate something feels, how distinct it appears from what we consider familiar. And when something crosses into direct interaction, that sense of distance begins to collapse. From a mainstream perspective, this is simply part of the narrative structure. The descent creates contrast, the interaction creates tension, and the eventual removal restores the original separation. It's a complete arc. But if we slow down and look at the experience of that arc, rather than just its structure, it reveals something a little more nuanced. The moment the Watchers interact with humanity, they are no longer entirely other. They are still described as different, still originating from a different domain, but their actions bring them into a shared space. A space where their influence becomes entangled with human experience. And once that entanglement occurs, the distinction between observer and observed becomes more complex, because interaction creates overlap. It creates a situation where the two sides are no longer fully separate systems, but part of a combined process, each influencing the other, even if that influence is uneven. And this is where the idea of distance begins to shift, because once something has interacted with a system, it leaves a trace, not necessarily a visible one, not necessarily something that can be measured directly, but something that becomes part of the system's ongoing state. So even after the Watchers are removed, the system they interacted with is no longer the same as it was before. And that raises a quiet but persistent question. If something has influenced a system, is it ever truly separate from it again? From a grounded, analytical perspective, the answer is often no. Influence, once introduced, becomes part of the system's history. It shapes what comes next, even if the original source is no longer present. And this idea, while abstract, connects to something very real. Because in many areas of study, whether it's ecology, sociology, or even information systems, we see that interactions create lasting connections. Systems that were once separate become linked through shared history, shared changes, shared outcomes. And those links don't simply disappear when the interaction ends. They persist, sometimes subtly, sometimes more visibly, but always as part of the system's structure. So when we think about the Watchers in this context, the question of distance becomes less about where they are, and more about how their interaction has altered the relationship between what was once separate. But there's another layer to this as well, because distance is not just about physical or structural separation, it's also about perception. What feels distant to us is often defined by what we understand. Things that are unfamiliar, unexplained, or outside our current framework tend to feel far away, even if they are close in other ways. And as understanding increases, that sense of distance can decrease. So when ancient people described the Watchers as beings from above, from beyond, it may not have been solely about location. It may have been about perspective, about describing something that felt outside the normal frame of experience. And over time, as interpretations evolve, that sense of distance can shift. What once felt entirely separate may begin to feel more connected. Not because the original description was incorrect, but because the framework used to understand it has changed. And this is something we see often in the way knowledge develops. Concepts that were once mysterious become more familiar. Ideas that were once distant become integrated into a broader understanding. The boundaries between categories begin to blur as new connections are recognized. So in a quiet way, the Watcher's narrative may also be reflecting that process. The movement from separation toward connection, from distance toward overlap. But it doesn't resolve that movement completely, because even as the Watchers become more connected through their interaction, they are still described as being removed, as being set apart once again. The boundary is re-established, at least in form, and that creates a kind of tension, a tension between what has been experienced and what is being restored. Because once overlap has occurred, restoring separation is not the same as returning to the original state. The memory of interaction remains, the effects remain, the system carries that history forward. So the distance that is re-established is not identical to the distance that existed before. It's a new kind of distance, one that includes the awareness that connection once occurred. And that awareness changes how the separation is understood. As you let that idea settle, it becomes clear that the Watchers are not just about beings moving between realms. They are about the shifting nature of boundaries themselves, about how separation and connection are not fixed states, but conditions that can change depending on interaction, perception, and time. And perhaps that's one of the deeper patterns embedded in the story. Not just that something crossed a boundary, but that once crossed, the nature of that boundary is never quite the same again. It becomes more complex, more layered, more difficult to define in simple terms. And in that complexity, the Watchers remain, not just as figures in a narrative, but as markers of a moment when distance and connection briefly overlapped, and in doing so, change the structure of the system in ways that continue to unfold. As we continue, the perspective begins to soften even further, not toward conclusions, but towards something quieter, something that sits beneath all the interpretations, all the narratives, all the attempts to define what the Watchers were or were not. Because at this point, after moving through the structure of the story, the patterns across cultures, the role of knowledge, the nature of observation, and the shifting boundaries between distance and connection, a different kind of question begins to emerge. Not what happened, but why does this pattern keep returning? The Watchers, as described in the Book of Enoch, are not just a one-time idea. They are part of a recurring structure, a way of describing a relationship between levels of awareness, between systems, between what is known and what is just beyond reach. And that structure appears in different forms across time. Not always with the same details, not always with the same language, but with a similar shape. Beings or perspectives that exist slightly outside the system, observing it, occasionally interacting with it, and then withdrawing again. From a mainstream standpoint, this is explained through the consistency of human cognition. We look for patterns. We create narratives that reflect our experiences. We project agency onto the unknown in ways that help us make sense of complexity. And that explanation is strong. It accounts for the repetition without requiring anything beyond human imagination and cultural development. But even within that explanation, there's something worth noticing. Because not all patterns repeat with the same clarity or persistence. Some ideas appear briefly and fade. Others evolve, change, and eventually lose their original form. But a few remain surprisingly stable, even as the context around them shifts. The Watchers seem to fall into that category. Not fixed, not identical across every version, but consistent enough that the core idea remains recognizable. And that suggests that the pattern is tied to something fundamental. Not necessarily something external, but something inherent to how we think about systems, about awareness, about our place within a larger context. Because at its core, the Watcher's narrative is not just about beings, it's about perspective. The idea that there can be a viewpoint outside the system. A way of seeing that is not limited to immediate participation. A form of awareness that exists at a different level. And that idea is something we encounter in many areas of thought. In philosophy, when we consider the possibility of objective observation. In science, when we attempt to study systems without influencing them. In everyday life, when we step back and try to see the bigger picture rather than getting lost in individual details. So the Watchers, in this sense, may be less about something that exists externally and more about a way of conceptualizing perspective itself, a way of imagining what it means to see from the outside. But there's a subtle complication here, because true observation without influence is difficult, sometimes impossible. Even in controlled scientific settings, the act of observing can change the system being observed, even if only slightly. The presence of attention, of measurement, of awareness introduces a variable that wasn't there before. And this brings us back, once again, to that delicate boundary. The boundary between watching and affecting. The Watchers, in their story, cross that boundary. They move from observation into interaction. And in doing so, they become part of the system they were observing. And perhaps that's where the deeper pattern lies. Not just in the existence of observers, but in the difficulty of remaining purely observational. Because once awareness is engaged deeply enough, the line between seeing and acting begins to blur. Curiosity leads to engagement. Engagement leads to influence. And influence leads to consequence. This sequence is not limited to ancient stories. It's something we encounter repeatedly, in different forms, across different contexts. So when the Watcher's narrative describes beings who begin as observers and become participants, it may be reflecting a pattern that is not tied to any specific time or place. A pattern that emerges whenever awareness meets opportunity. But there's one more layer to consider. The idea that the Watchers are remembered at all. Because for a story to persist, for it to be written, preserved, revisited, it has to resonate in some way. It has to connect with something that feels meaningful, even if that meaning is not fully understood. And the fact that the Watchers continue to be discussed, analyzed, and reinterpreted suggests that the pattern they represent is still relevant. Not necessarily as a literal account, but as a framework for thinking. A way of exploring questions that don't have simple answers. Questions about observation, about knowledge, about boundaries, about the relationship between understanding and action. And as you let that idea settle, there's no need to resolve it into a single conclusion. It's enough to recognize that the story has endured, not because it provides certainty, but because it invites reflection. It creates space for thinking about things that are not easily defined, things that sit just beyond the edge of what we can fully explain. And in that space, the Watchers remain, not as a fixed answer, but as a kind of reference point, a way of returning again and again to the same quiet questions, about what it means to observe, about what happens when observation turns into involvement, and about how those moments, those subtle shifts, continue to shape the systems we are part of, often in ways we only begin to understand much later. As we move into this next part, everything begins to slow even further. Not because there is less to explore, but because what remains is quieter. Less about identifying patterns, and more about sitting with what those patterns imply when you stop trying to resolve them too quickly. Because at this point, the Watchers are no longer just figures in the Book of Enoch, or echoes across ancient traditions. They've become something more subtle, something that exists not just in texts, but in the way we think about systems, about awareness, and about our place within processes that are larger than any single moment. And when you reach that point, a different kind of question begins to form. Not, were the Watchers real? And not even, what did they represent? But something quieter. What does it mean that we keep returning to this idea? Because throughout everything we've explored, the knowledge they brought, the boundaries they crossed, the consequences that followed, the way their story was preserved and reinterpreted, there has been one constant. The idea of observation, not just seeing, but watching with awareness, watching with understanding, watching from a position that is slightly removed, slightly elevated, slightly outside. And that idea, when you sit with it long enough, begins to feel less like something distant and more like something familiar. Because in many ways, we live with that dual perspective all the time. We experience the world directly, through action, through involvement, through participation. But at the same time, we are capable of stepping back, of observing ourselves within that experience, not physically stepping outside, but mentally shifting perspective. And in that moment, there's a kind of separation, a quiet distance between what we are doing and what we are noticing. And that distance, however small, changes the way we understand what's happening. So when ancient narratives describe watchers, beings whose primary role is to observe, It may not just be describing something external, it may also be reflecting something internal, something about the structure of awareness itself. But there's a complication, because as we've seen, the watchers do not remain purely observational. They cross the boundary, they become involved, and when they do, the system changes. And that mirrors something we encounter constantly, because observation, when sustained long enough, often leads to engagement. When you understand something deeply enough, there's a natural tendency to interact with it, to test it, to influence it, to see what happens when you move from watching to doing. And that transition is not always obvious. It doesn't always feel like a clear decision. Sometimes it happens gradually, a small action here, a slight adjustment there, until eventually you are no longer just observing the system. You are part of what is shaping it. And that's where the story of the Watchers begins to feel less like something ancient and more like something ongoing. Not in a literal sense, not as a direct continuation of the same narrative, but as a pattern that repeats in different forms. The movement from awareness to interaction, from distance to involvement, from observation to consequence. And what's interesting is that this pattern does not carry a simple moral. The Watchers are not portrayed as purely wrong or purely right. Their actions are not framed in terms that resolve easily into good or bad. Instead, the story focuses on what happens when a boundary is crossed, on the complexity that follows. And that complexity is something we recognize, because in many situations, the outcomes of our actions are not immediately clear. The effects unfold over time. The consequences ripple outward in ways that are difficult to predict. So the story doesn't offer a clear instruction. It offers a reflection, a way of thinking about how awareness, action, and consequence are connected. And as you let that idea settle, there's one more layer that begins to emerge. The idea that perhaps the most important part of the story is not the Watchers themselves, but the moment before they act, the moment when they are still observing, still at a distance, still able to see the system as a whole without being fully entangled in it. Because that moment, however brief, is where perspective is clearest, where patterns are visible, where the potential consequences of action can, at least in theory, be understood before they unfold. And once that moment passes, once action begins, that clarity becomes harder to maintain. So in a quiet way, the Watcher's narrative may also be pointing toward the value of that pause, that space between seeing and doing, that moment where awareness exists without immediate action. Not as a rule, not as a command, but as a possibility. A reminder that observation itself has value, that understanding a system, even without changing it, is a meaningful state, and that once action is taken, the system changes in ways that cannot be fully reversed. So as everything we've explored begins to settle, the Watchers feel less like a mystery to be solved, and more like a perspective to return to. A way of thinking about the relationship between awareness and action. A way of noticing the subtle boundary between watching and participating. And perhaps most importantly, a way of recognizing that the moments before we act, those quiet, often overlooked moments of observation, may carry more significance than we realize. Not because they determine everything that follows, but because they shape how we understand what comes next. And as that thought gently settles, there's no need to push it further, no need to define it completely. It's enough to simply notice it and to allow it to remain open. As we arrive at this final part, everything begins to settle into a quieter kind of understanding. Not a conclusion in the traditional sense, but more like a gentle closing of a circle. Because after moving through the layers of the Watchers, their origins in the Book of Enoch, the echoes in earlier fragments like the Book of Genesis, the patterns across cultures, the questions of knowledge, observation, boundaries, and consequence, what remains is not a single answer. It's a perspective, something that doesn't demand certainty, but instead invites a quieter kind of awareness. Because if there's one thing that becomes clear after sitting with this story long enough, it's that the watchers are not easily contained within one interpretation. They resist being reduced to either pure myth or hidden history. They exist in that space in between, where narratives are shaped not just by what is known, but by how humans attempt to understand what feels just beyond their reach. And that space is where the story becomes most meaningful. From a grounded perspective, everything we've explored can be understood through well-established frameworks. The Watchers can be seen as part of the natural evolution of ancient storytelling, an expansion of earlier ideas, a symbolic explanation for the emergence of knowledge and complexity, a reflection of moral and philosophical concerns about boundaries and responsibility. That explanation is stable. It fits within what we know about how cultures develop narratives, how texts are written, preserved, and interpreted over time. But even within that grounded understanding, something remains. A quiet sense that the story is doing more than just explaining. It's exploring. Exploring what it means to observe without interfering, and what happens when that boundary is crossed. Exploring how knowledge moves from one place to another, and how that movement changes the system it enters. Exploring the relationship between distance and connection, between awareness and action, between perspective and consequence. And these are not questions that belong only to the past. They are ongoing. Because even now, in ways both obvious and subtle, we continue to navigate those same dynamics. We observe systems, natural, social, technological, trying to understand how they function. We develop knowledge, sometimes faster than we can fully integrate it. We face moments where we must decide whether to act, how to act, and what the potential consequences might be. And often, we do so without complete certainty, without a full view of the system, without knowing exactly how our actions will unfold over time. So in that sense, the Watchers are not just figures from an ancient narrative. They are a reflection of a position we find ourselves in again and again. The position of being aware, but not all-knowing, capable of observing, but also capable of influencing, standing at the edge of action, with just enough understanding to recognize that crossing that edge changes things. And perhaps that's why the story has endured. Not because it provides answers, but because it mirrors something fundamental. Something about the way we exist within systems that are larger than us. Something about the way awareness leads to curiosity, and curiosity leads to interaction, and interaction leads to consequences that extend beyond the original moment. But as everything begins to settle, there's one final detail worth noticing. The Watchers in the story are remembered primarily for the moment they crossed the boundary, not for the time they spent observing, not for the clarity they may have had before they became involved, but for the moment they acted. And that tells us something about how stories are told. We tend to focus on action, on change, on the moments that disrupt the flow of events. Those are the moments that stand out, that get recorded, that become part of the narrative. But the quiet moments, the observation, the awareness, the understanding that exists before action, those often remain in the background, unnoticed. And yet, those moments are just as important, because they shape how action unfolds. They influence the decisions that are made. They define the perspective from which the system is understood. So if there is something to take from the story of the Watchers, it may not be a conclusion about what they were, or whether they existed in any literal sense. It may simply be a reminder of that quiet space before action, the space where observation is still separate from influence, where awareness has not yet become intervention, where the system can still be seen, even if not fully understood. And in that space, there is a kind of balance, a moment where nothing has been altered yet, but everything that follows is already beginning to take shape. So as you rest with that idea, there's no need to resolve it into something definite, no need to decide exactly what the watchers were or what they mean in absolute terms. It's enough to recognize the pattern, to notice how it appears, how it repeats, how it connects the ancient and the modern in a way that feels both distant and familiar at the same time. Because sometimes, the most enduring stories are not the ones that tell us what to think, but the ones that quietly change how we look. And as the night continues and your thoughts begin to slow, that perspective can remain, softly, in the background, not as a conclusion, but as something to return to, whenever the line between watching and acting begins to come into view.